Hello and welcome. My name is Scott Bellis. I'm a counselor for the BC Yukon region and also the current council president of Equity. I'm really pleased that everybody has signed on to attend this very interesting workshop all about conflict resolution skills. So navigating a creative space can sometimes create very intense work environments. I think we've all experienced that at some point in our artistic lives. That can lead to friction, disagreements, even arguments sometimes. And I think that learning how to best work through that stuff is very crucial to our creative process and helpful to it as well. So I'm looking forward to this. Before we begin, I would like to read a land acknowledgement statement. I'm currently speaking to you from Vancouver, which is located on the ancestral unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. These peoples of the Coast Salish people have been the residents of this area for uncounted generations, and I acknowledge the continuing relationship that those people have to the lands and waters of this region. I'm going to just quickly read Equity's statement of affirmation. This is a statement that we employ at all of our public member events, and it goes like this. Equity embraces an open and inclusive environment and encourages respectful behavior that affirms the dignity of all individuals. Equity further recognizes our shared responsibility for vigilance in creating and maintaining this environment. Equity recognizes a shared history with Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada. In honor of those who have gone before us, Equity commits to working toward understanding and actionable practices of reconciliation. Okay, welcome to the sixth in a series of workshops and seminars Equity is proud to bring you on topics of great importance to our members and to the industry at large. Equity gratefully acknowledges the Government of Canada for the funding of these programs through the Department of Canadian Heritage as part of their Canada Performing Arts Workers Resilience Fund. After this workshop, we will be sending all of you a link to complete a brief survey. This is very important. We want your feedback on these workshops and your guidance as we plan future events for our members. So please fill that out when you get the link. As usual, if you have a question, I encourage you to use the raise hand option down at the bottom of your screen there, or put your question in the Q&A section, as questions that you put in the chat may get lost as conversation starts to trickle through. So please use the Q&A. Okay, now I'd like to introduce our panelists and our moderator for this workshop. First of all, Charles C. Smith is a poet, playwright, and essayist who has written and edited 12 books. He won second prize for his play Last Days for the Desperate from Black Theatre Canada, has edited 3 collections of poetry, has 4 published books of poetry, and his poetry has appeared in numerous journals and magazines. Charles was the founder of the Black Perspectives Cultural Program in Regent Park and recently received a grant from the Ontario Arts Council's Writers' Reserve Grants Program and the Toronto Arts Council Writers Grants Program. That is Charles. Welcome, Charles. Nadia Bello has 20 years experience in nonprofits and education and is the director of People and Culture at Park People, a unique national nonprofit that supports and mobilizes community park groups, community organizers, nonprofits, park professionals, and funders to activate the power of parks. I love that. She is also a certified training and development professional and certified Canadian human resources professional. She holds a Master of Science in Organized Development from the School of Public Affairs at American University in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Nadia. Ryan Cunningham is Nahewi Cree from Amiskwasy, which is also known as Edmonton, and a member of the Michelle Band First Nation. He is co-founder of Alberta Aboriginal Performing Arts, where he was the founding artistic director. He was the artistic director at Native Earth Performing Arts from 2014 to 2017. In 2017, he founded Cunningham Concepts and Creations, a production management company that tours the world with the award-winning play Huff, written and performed by Cliff Cardinal. As an actor, he has performed on stages across the country for the past 27 years. That's a long time. Currently, he is an artist in residence at the BMO Lab at the University of Toronto and Canadian Stage Theatre. And this year was awarded the Rising Star Award as the Emerging Director at Crow's Theatre. Congratulations and welcome, Ryan. And lastly, Jennifer Khor. Jennifer is the supervising lawyer and project manager for Community Legal Assistance Society for their Sharp Workplaces Legal Advice Clinic, providing free legal advice to anyone who has experienced workplace sexual harassment in BC. Jennifer and the lawyers on the Sharp Workplaces roster provide legal advice in the area of human rights, workers' compensation, employment and labor, and criminal law as it relates to workplace sexual harassment. She is committed to ensuring that the clinic takes a holistic, trauma-informed approach in assisting clients. She also leads their campaign against the misuse of non-disclosure agreements in BC. The partners with CLAS partners with Can't Buy My Silence in the campaign for legislation to restrict the use of NDAs to prevent further harm to complainants. Welcome, Jennifer. I will now hand things over to our moderator, Charles C. Smith. Welcome, Charles. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Scott, and I'm glad to be here with the other my co-panelists and to be doing this for Canadian Actors Equity. Ryan has just put a note in the chat room. He's going to be turning his camera off. He's got some tech issues today that we hope to be able to navigate well, and so on. I'm in Taikaranto, otherwise called Toronto, and here the Indigenous people have been here from time immemorial, comprise the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, the Mississauga of the Credit. This is Treaty 13 territory claimed by the Mississauga of the Credit over the what we call the Toronto land. And there have been other peoples who have come to this territory from time immemorial. I find it really important to get a better understanding of various Indigenous nations that existed pre-colonial contact and that continue to exist in our time. So we have an understanding of, if we're building relationships with Indigenous people, we know who we're dealing with, so to speak, and not just this homogenized sense of nativeness or indigeneity. Really honored to share this program today with these others who will be joining speaking in a few moments. And I'm glad that Canadian Actors Equity has actually asked for us to deliver this. One thing that I missed in my bio note, I'm also the convener / executive director of Cultural Pluralism and Arts Movement Ontario. And in that, we do a lot of work around anti-racism, decoloniality, human rights, harassment, nonviolence in the workplace, bringing people together and so on to address those timely issues. To start the session, it's important to note this is going to be not an easy conversation. We're talking about conflict. Most people don't like to talk about conflict. Like, how do we avoid it? Maybe it'll go away. Maybe I misinterpreted, or it's not that big a deal. I don't want to create waves. And in the arts environment, because I am an artist, and I also work with performing artists, there are times when it's important to actually address it. Whether it's in onboarding artists and being clear about what they're supposed to do or what room they have to contribute to a creation process, to basically honoring their bodies in the space that they are working in. And a lot of that has to do with changes in our times. The whole human rights area number one, the area of self-employment, number two. And when I talk about the human rights area, really get into the particularities of identities, whether it's on race and the various racialized groups that exist in this country, Black, South Asian, Asian, we can go on with that, and also the differences in terms of their time here, et cetera. In terms of gender identity, looking more at the LGBTQ2 plus identities that are growing as more and more individuals are expressing who they are in their bodies and how that should be recognized in the public sphere. There are a lot of things that we want to look at, and I really want to thank those of you who did communicate with, I guess it would be Randy, to give us a couple of questions that you were hoping to be able to address today. So I'll read the questions, and then I'm going to make a presentation, and I'll be followed by Ryan, who will address issues around systemics and their impacts. We probably should have a break somewhere in there, so I imagine maybe after Ryan we'll have a break. And then Nadia will come on with potential paths to resolution. And those paths could be interesting and thorny at times, but they are paths. And then Jennifer will look at legal issues, particularly as it impacts the self-employed. So your questions that you asked us are these. How do we talk about long-standing oppressive practices with people in positions of power over us? How do we speak truth to power? Big question, especially if there's a contract and there are funds at the end of that contract and one is self-employed and relies on those funds. How do you approach disagreement? I've disagreed in the past, but was too scared of conflict to bring it up. I'm curious to talk about intergenerational conflict and how to avoid this and resolve this. I think we'll be able to talk about that, certainly. What are ways we can handle conflict resolution as someone with anxiety and who finds conflict in general tough to confront? That's what I started off by saying. It's not an easy conversation. And when do you know it's time to step away from a project or a company or an artist? Also a very important question. You say, this is not for me. I need to be able to move on. So as I say, this may be an uncomfortable conversation for some of you because it is talking about conflict. And as you can hear from the questions you've asked us to look at, you know it's an uncomfortable conversation. So I'm going to have to ask you to bear with us. We've provided you with a variety of resources, and we will share with you the presentations that we are making. So you have that as tools, as insights, as areas to look further into your own situations and dilemmas. And, if you need to get in touch with any of us, I know Randy can provide you with our email addresses so you can have further conversation with us and so on. So I'm going to stop on that and begin to share my screen. So again, as I mentioned, I'm with Cultural Pluralism and the Arts Movement Ontario, and that's where I'm presenting from today. So what do we want to look at? This is a real issue of concern in the performing arts these days. I know my group has been involved in a number of conflict issues that have arisen between artists and between artists and arts organizations. Some of them do deal with those artists whose identities could be protected by human rights grounds, others not. But nonetheless, it is a very, very timely issue, and one where we know some of the consequences of not addressing it have been really injurious to individuals. So I've been part of, and some of you may have heard about Cultural Human Resources Council, its Respectful Workplaces program that it ran for a couple of years. Some of you may recall what that program, why that program came into existence. It was out of a story coming out of Soul Pepper and the behavior of its previous artistic director toward women. It took, I can't remember how many women in a press conference to actually raise the issue, even though they had worked there for years, and to kind of ensure that there would be some transition that would ensure that he moved on, which he did, and that the executive or the director of human resources, his wife at the time, also moved on. So that program went across the country. I can't remember how many organizations overall got involved. It was this 2-hour seminar that most organizations participated with, and I delivered a few. And I have to say, it probably raised more awareness than actually resolving issues. So the do's and don'ts, we want to call it that. With my organization, Cultural Pluralism and the Arts Movement Ontario, we've done a number of equity and anti-racism reviews. Some of them are on our website, like with Luminato, for example, or the Society of Creative Musicians, SOCAN, Fall for Dance North, Peggy Baker Dance Projects, and some others, and some that we can't share, sadly, online because the client wants us to keep them confidential, but that includes organizations like the Art Gallery of Ontario, in particular. So when we do those reviews, one issue that keeps coming up is about conflict. It is, I can't tell you how much we discovered through SOCAN that people, their harassment policy dated back to 1998 when we first saw it, right? Way out of date. Secondly, in their view at the time, it was probably more important to deal with spitballing and not bringing weapons into the workplace, which is a good idea, than it was around inequities on race, gender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when we did have conversations with staff, and all of this is documented in the report, they raised very many concerns about their sense of well-being in the workplace and feeling they had no place to go. With what we call SAPAMOPOC, it's a project that involves a cohort of organizations working together. And one of the areas that we deal with, and Nadia's been very helpful with us in that regard, is around conflict resolution. Because many organizations, as we move to become more quote unquote diverse, are hiring Indigenous, Black, people of color, persons whose sexual orientation is different, et cetera, and not fully sure about, is this diversity hire actually bottom line essential to our business? Or is this diversity hire, check, we filled a box, but we haven't thought it through. So I won't name an organization, but there was an organization that we did do a review, and I can tell you that within the first 2 years of its equity implementation, it had 2 equity coordinators. The first one was Indigenous Two-Spirited, who left after a year. The second one was a Black woman who left after a year. I don't know where they are now, but I can begin knowing both of them. I can tell you something was happening there that they weren't comfortable with. And so we know these are issues that are going across a variety of organizations, whether or not an artist received funding and paid another artist less than what was in the grant application, even though they got the full application, and so on. We've done a lot of workshops on workplace non-harassment, non-violence, as well as helped organizations design policies because we're being asked, not that we're saying you need to do this, we're being asked because they are recognizing they have conflict. And this happens in a number of areas. One that was really quite open and working with us was Workman Arts. Many people know that's an arts organization that deals with artists who works with artists who have mental health challenges. And there are challenges that come up in between those individuals. They can be based on race, they can be based upon the way in which the individuals behave, et cetera, et cetera. But they needed to have work done because of conflict between artists. Anti-Black racism, education and training, again, because of issues following George Floyd, in particular, although these have been existing for some time, a number of organizations have said, how do we handle, some of you may have seen what happened, I believe, a couple of years ago with the National Ballet, and one of its Black dancers who decided to call them out because he felt that they had misrepresented his image. And that took them some time to address. And it involved them actually having to have staff-wide, artist-wide training on anti-Black racism. And then you may be familiar with what we call our Gathering Divergence festivals. These are areas where we get together twice a year to bring artists and panelists together to talk about things. One of the things that we've been able to do in that is to ask various artists to contribute to what we call our Living Skins Reels. We give them a question, they say what they want to say. We're not saying you can only say this, you can only say that, and then we show it. Let me tell you, we are hearing a lot of things. We are hearing a lot of things about people feeling they are being blocked from entry into their arts practice, about people feeling they are being discriminated in terms of their arts practice. Some of you may know a couple of years ago, I think it was Shakespeare in Action, where a young Black cast en masse decided not going to do the show because the artistic director, a white man, decided to use the N-word and then defended himself for using the N-word over and over and saying, well, I know, da, da, da. Well, that was an explosion. That was an explosion. So these things, I just wanted to foreground us to say, we know these things are happening, and we need to figure out, as you're asking, how do we talk about them? How do we deal with them? How do we come to some type of positive resolution? And if we can't, how do we say, okay, I need to walk away from this? So what are the focus on the challenges that we're facing? Onboarding artists. Onboarding, right now we have arts councils saying, how diverse are you? Right? And so the question is, are we doing that with sincerity? In other words, we're looking for an actor or a dancer who happens to be of diverse background, but also is a competent dancer, actor, etc., that one could stage. Also, the question is, how does one bring that person on board? Hi, just join our rehearsal, or a conversation about who are you, here's what we do, well, how can we understand each other? There are many issues, particularly with older artists who have been around for some time, and you'll notice that in a bit of the Peggy Baker Dance Projects report, and have quite a bit of credibility in the artistic community, and so basically can call their own shots. And people are happy to work with them, right? Say, wow, I can work with so-and-so that's going to help my profile, et cetera. I'm going to have secure income for a bit. And it just left as that. Well, those things are changing. Artists who are being onboarded want to have a better understanding of who they're working with, what the circumstances are under which they are going to work, what role can they play next in the creative process, and so on. The creative process brings challenges in terms of how an artistic director might term the work that he, she, they are doing. Is it, I tell you what to do and you do it, and if you sign the contract, that's just the way it is? Or is it, hey, there are some ideas I have, but I'm open to a conversation. Are we clear about that? And even if it's work that someone has said, this is how I want to do it, can there still be an opportunity for positive feedback from, let's say, an artist who's involved? Or is it, this way or see you later kind of thing? So there are questions, and the creative process is always difficult, particularly in performance, because you're working with others. There's going to be an issue that gets addressed somewhere along the way in terms of rehearsal time, etc. How do you use the rehearsal time? Is it strictly everybody's on the floor for the whole 3-5 hours or whatever? Are there breaks where people can talk about how they're feeling, how they're understanding the work, what they don't get about the work? I'm hearing a lot, oh, we can't do that because that's money, that's time. We don't have that time. And then conflict ensues. And then you end up having to have that time and probably need to spend more time. I've also talked about earlier checking the box on diversity, because that is a big one these days about, I get calls regularly. Who can I have on this panel? Who can I have on that? Who can I have on this, et cetera? And I have to question, what's the purpose? Have you done any of this before? What is your motivation? How are you going to sustain this? As opposed to, oh, check, we did it. We can put in a report. We had this. Communications and role clarity. How to communicate with artists and to have clarity around the respective roles that people are playing. So even if one is an artistic director, how does one communicate to the artist one is involving and talk clearly about role clarity? Here's my role as the artistic director. Here's your role. Are there things we might need to negotiate around that or come to understand? What are the protocols in that kind of conversation? So to think of it in advance as opposed to, hey, you're in the rehearsal room, join, whatever role you're supposed to play. And then the other questions that come up is how to address both raising an issue and receiving that issue. And one of the challenges around dealing with issues of conflict is oftentimes, this is what we're seeing, I'm seeing in particular, it necessitates an explosion. which tends to me to think that, wow, there isn't really a lot of forethought to how to have a conversation with an artist you may just be working with for the first time or whatever time it is. And that it takes a long time before that artist will go through the questions, should I raise it? Am I correct? Do I understand it? How can I raise it? Is there someone else I can talk to? Till it's out there. And next thing you know, there's a mess all over the place. A year ago or so, we did work with public legal education and outreach on its report, Now More Than Ever, PLEO as it's called. And that report was provided to you. That report was really important because it really got to artists and arts organizations about some of the legal issues that they felt were important to address, and the importance of having publicly available legal support to address those issues. Because, they understood, Martha Rands and her group, that many artists are self-employed. Not a lot of money to put into legal services, into getting lawyers on board. That also processes to resolve the legal processes could take a lot of time, whether it's human rights tribunals or going to courts, etc. So I'm just going to give some of the key issues that people came up with in their concerns, and you can see why, being here, you're not alone. 94% of artists who replied to the survey felt that they are facing unique legal needs. I have to foreground this by saying that most of the responses came from IBPOC artists. So that's one area where there was some concern. There were concerns around the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action, which was echoed by many in the survey. There was uncertainty on how to work or integrate Indigenous practices and protocols into their artistic practices. And we can talk about that a little later on when I come up with one of the examples that caused real troubles that some of you may have read about in the Toronto Star and elsewhere. The need to include appropriation of Indigenous knowledge into current copyright frameworks and how to treat Indigenous forms of artistic practice in the context of intellectual property rights was another concern that respondents did raise. They also talked about issues of copyright and intellectual property, including challenges in navigating the digital space due to constantly changing technology and delay in updated regulations. We're all on Zoom these days, and as we know, Canada Council has a fair amount of money in digital technology, and so we're seeing more and more things on screens than we had in the past. And so there are real questions around ownership, whether in terms of copyright or in terms of intellectual property. Harassment in the workplace and human rights came up. Liability and insurance came up. Defamation and libel came up as major issues. Contracts, digital privacy, employment, and business-related issues. The web-enabled access as how do you use that well and provide information legal information to artists. Government materials were found to be not very well accessed. And artists tended to agree that an independent multidisciplinary legal clinic model is preferred. In other words, having a legal clinic that can provide advice and support to artists on how best to address issues around conflict, whatever they may be. So that's what PLEO, and in terms of priorities, what artists saw as priorities were, you can imagine, copyright, intellectual property, and contracts. The top three things, ownership and fees, right? And clarity around ownership with contracts. Digital privacy was another area. Issues of social media, another area. The business that individuals work in, employment, their status is mostly self-employment, harassment coming in at 8th in terms of priority, issues of property, governance, defamation, and defamation of property. So those were the areas that the artists chose as responsibilities in terms of what they saw as the important need for legal support to enable them to deal with situations where they felt they were in conflict. I've gone over this. In terms of intellectual property rights, it was including questions related to cultural appropriation. We see a lot of this in terms of the appropriation of indigenous arts and so on. And we've seen it in some cases in the area of Black arts, et cetera. Contracts. What are the challenges in writing and enforcing contracts in the various arts disciplines? So artist to artist, it's usually one person to another. Here's a contract. Well, what happens if some difficulties come up in the contract? Can the person who is being offered the contract have some input into the contract? Collecting royalties and fees. Whose job is it to inform the artist, here are your royalties and here are your fees? And ideally, there's no issues around collecting those. Performance and reproduction fees. And so particularly in multidisciplinary productions or recordings, how to be clear with the artists around roles and responsibilities, and also the responsibilities of, say, an artistic director with a group. And then finally, the area of employment are what artists saw as major priority for themselves. And that's, again, having consistent ways of working. So I'm going to do a couple of case studies, and some of it you have in, they're significant studies that we do because we do think it's important to be thorough in any kind of equity review that we do. Any equity, I should say, it's equity, anti-racism, decoloniality, that are the three lenses that we use when we talk about doing equity anti-racism reviews. So with Peggy Baker dance projects, the issue that we were invited to work with was Peggy's remounting her body as words with contemporary views on gender. So non-binary individuals, individuals who are racialized, indigenous, two-spirited, LGBTQ2+. A number of challenges came up around that. Interpreting identity. As the artistic director, Peggy interpreted what those identities might look like on the floor. That identity, those identities did not necessarily match the ways in which those individuals saw themselves. And so you can imagine that at some point along the way, there would be some conflict around that. The creative process, how to then bring people into the room, particularly given this kind of diversity and background, and have them be able to work well together to really share space, to come to understand each other, as well as the work that they were invited to be involved in. So what does the creative process look like? How would a non-binary person see Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex being remounted in the title of her body as words? How would an indigenous two-spirited person see that work? So what lens is the work being looked at? And how is that understood and being shared? Between then and now, in the past, then this is probably the dilemma we faced. We gave a lot of, we've given a lot of, credence to the genius of artistic directors and so on, or to creative artists, et cetera. And I'm not saying we shouldn't. However, times have changed. And time has changed because of the struggles of individuals and organizations, including artists, to say the whole area of equity, anti-racism, decoloniality, and decolonization, we're talking about indigenous peoples, needs to be on the table, And that means, in many respects, I have a right to share my thoughts on the work. It also, and I've come through this process, many of us work collectively. We don't work under the umbrella of someone tells us what to do. We kind of come together under an idea and then we share thoughts around that idea. That's very different than walking into rehearsal where the artistic director or a rehearsal director will say, for the next 3 hours, we're doing this, no talk, no comments, just do it. Interesting, when we were doing work with the National Ballet, the dancers there were beginning to talk this way, to say, we don't want to just be told what to do. We want to be able to look at the work that we're doing and have a conversation about it. And then finally, what to do, leadership and change. So one of the questions you have is around intergenerational connections. Those of us who may be a bit on in our years may be more used to the directive process. Those who are younger may be more used to working in collaboration and collectivities, and how to begin to establish leadership around that and being open to changes that enable the artists in the space to be, fully present. In other words, that they know that they can contribute. Doesn't mean they have to contribute, but they know that they can, that there's every opportunity to do so, not just by word of someone saying it, but by seeing it, what the experience is. So, for example, you'll notice toward the end of the Peggy Baker Dance Project's report, there are clear roles around the artistic director's responsibilities, the associate artistic director's responsibilities, and then the artist's responsibilities. So it's very clear what those agreements would be to say, okay, if we enter into the space as an artist, here's what you can expect from the artistic director, the associate artistic director. As an associate artistic director or an artistic director, here's what you're asking the artist for, and there's room for the artist to raise what they feel they need as part of that. So that was really important. And part of that was looking at particular terminology. So you'll notice that in that document, I think we provide definitions of 5 key terms, anti-racism being one, equity being another, decoloniality. And we say decoloniality, not decolonization, because Peggy Baker Dance Company is not an indigenous company, nor an indigenous nation. But there can be a mindset around deconstructing the impact of colonization on her mode of business. But I highly doubt she's going to declare herself a nation anytime soon. So anti-racism, equity, decoloniality, pluralism were key terms that we defined. And when we came to the term of pluralism, which is what we use in our organization, we were basically saying that each of us as individuals have certain creative gifts. And the question is, how do we give room to those gifts when we are together so that we can all feel present and be in our full selves and not feel that we have to siphon off parts of our identities in order to fit. So it really brings a lot of questions. And those are important in terms of how to look at it. So around anti-racism, for example, one has to be able to say, well, what roles can we play as persons of color, example? Or what are the barriers that individuals might face? So as I mentioned, the example with that organization of the indigenous two-spirited women and the Black women, the organization did not think about how to have its system be welcoming. Right? Doesn't mean that they did anything overt. It just may mean Spike Lee said it best in Do the Right Thing. No brothers on the wall. Right? So if you've seen the movie, you know that led to a riot at some point along the way. And his point was, I don't see myself in this institution that I work in. Why should I don't feel I belong here. I don't feel you want me here. I happen to be here for whatever purpose. So 2 areas that I mentioned a bit earlier, CanStage and Luminato. Some of you may be familiar with the attempt, well, it wasn't an attempt, it was actually done, but Canadian Stage and Luminato on something called New Monuments. It was projected to be a performance on CBC that would look at the impact of colonization on this land, beginning with the impact on the first peoples, indigenous peoples. There's a wonderful poem by Duke Redbird which starts it, and then to kind of go from there up to the arrival of, Blacks as slaves, the Chinese as rail workers, go on and on and on. One of the challenges is that the artistic director for that did not work in very much the same way as the artists who were brought in. Because some of the artists who were brought in, they work in collaborative, collective ways. The artistic director is very directive. And so a lot of explosions came up in that, and people began to feel very uncomfortable in the process. And so the eruptions caught the attention of the leadership in both organizations, where they felt they just had to do something about it, which is one of the documents that I did send on to you about the onboarding was requested by Can Stage Illuminato. They asked Sapamo to prepare that report. And I did so with Anita La Salva, a very well-known theater practitioner. You may be more familiar with a recent one called of Water that Illuminato wanted to bring in last spring. I keep having to think what back in time. Yeah, in June. So of Water is the name of an indigenous artist collective. The idea, which I believe came from a British woman, a white British woman, was to have an exhibit around water. And for some reason, Illuminato thought, well, if you're going to have an exhibit around water, it should involve indigenous people. So they attempted to bring together this relationship. How they did it obviously did not work, because a day before the performance was supposed to happen, Illuminato shut it down, which led to, as you can imagine, a lot of anger and back and forth, and resulting in a Toronto Star article back in, I believe, August, that played this issue out in the public domain. So a bit of damage for Illuminato, 2 years in a row. And we have to remember, in Illuminato, back in, I think, 2014 or 15, they wanted to bring on an exhibit focusing on human zoos. The exhibit premiered in Edinburgh at the festival, and it was done by a white South African. When it was attempted to be mounted in London, UK, it got shut down by Black artists. And then the then artistic director of Illuminato wanted to bring it here. I think you can gather it didn't happen. There was furious letters being written to Illuminato that if you bring it here, you'll pay the consequences for that. So it didn't happen, right? So these are just the accumulations of things that I'm only talking about a few things. And in our research with Sapamo, you can go on our website, we've got tons of reports, perhaps too many, but we can think it's important to be able to bring out into the public what is happening now in the arts community, particularly around some of the issues that we deal with in terms of equality generally, and then anti-racism, equity, decoloniality as it impacts on persons of color, the LGBTQ2 plus community, women, indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, and so on. I just have a few more things to go through with what we found in the onboarding research that we did for Can Stage and Illuminato. And is have initial meetings, talk to artists. As I say, I have a performing arts group called Wind and Leaves Collective. Well, I invite an artist in, we're going to have a conversation, coffee or these days Zoom, and it could be a couple hours. I want to get to know who this artist is. I want this artist to know who I am, what my intentions are with work that I want to stage and I'm working on, what the opportunities are for a conversation about the work, and so on. And then, to make the artist that I'm inviting to work and ideally feel comfortable to say, I'm not getting this, no matter when, first day, 100th day, whatever. The daily interfacing with artists and communication with artists is really critical. Not just sign the contract, here's your rehearsal space, we'll see you later, but check-ins. Is it going well? Everything okay? Is there something else that we might be able to provide? You have to remember, this is really a relationship that is taking place between artists. And so it's important to maintain that relationship as best as possible. And that also, I think, means for the artist who invites another artist in to check in, to say, hey, how are things going? They're okay, right? Reach out, make sure that the communication is clear. What are policies, procedures, and codes of conduct that even individuals can have, not necessarily written in paper, but ways that you can say to artists that you work with, here's how we work. Here's the way we raise issues. Here are the values that we aspire toward and the behaviors that support those values. It becomes really important in talking across differences, and we're all different people. And for artists, because we, do connect with different people from time to time, how do we make this a practice so we're not just making assumptions that this is everyone understands these things and will go along the same way? How to have sustainable approaches and the clarity of roles and responsibilities, as I've talked about. Dealing with conflict and challenging issues, which you'll be hearing more about later on with the other presenters. I'm not going to get into too much detail here because there are others who are taking care of that. Monitoring and reporting, even if it's just to a small group of friends or whatever, like how do you know what's going on there? Are there ways that you can say, that didn't work exactly as I was hoping, so maybe I should make notes of it, write it down, etc. And then obviously how to get ongoing education and training, because these issues, I always say that in this area, sadly, truth is stranger than fiction, and there is no exhaustive list of what might violate certain policies, procedures, laws, etc. We continue to learn more and more, sadly, every day. So what are the critical issues? And I'm going to wrap up on this. Understanding equity, diversity, anti-racism, decoloniality, decolonization, and pluralism, what we put into the Peggy Baker document as key terms to understand. What is onboarding? Right? It's not just, hi, come in and here's your role. Is, as I said, what is the relationship that one artist wants to make to another? What is the invitation about? Being honest with oneself. And as I said, if it's about a diversity checklist, you might want to rethink it. The invitation should be, I've seen your work, I know your work, I've heard about your work. I'd like to see how we might be able to work together because I think it's going to add a lot to what I'm currently doing. Not I'm looking for, just happen to be looking for. Is there room to discuss protocols? One of the things that of Water has said to Illuminato is, yeah, thanks for the contract. Can we have input into it? So it works for them, right? And then what are the practices in terms of building and maintaining relationships? And how can they be put into place? A lot to think of. I have a friend who in this business who often says, you have to go slow before you can go fast. And the slow part is really thinking is unlearning. We usually do this. That may not work here. So how can I be on guard for finding out new possibilities of making connections and building relationships? And then being clear about what involvement in creation does an artist have responsibility for. Being really clear so that the artist coming in knows, hey, I can contribute this full or part or whatever it might be. And how is this communicated? How do you communicate that to an artist that you wish to engage and invite in? So those were some of the issues that I discovered in the work that we are doing with SAPAMO. And certainly if there are questions, happy to answer some. And then we'll introduce Ryan Cunningham, who will talk from his perspective. So I'm not seeing anything in the question room at this point in time. We can always come back to questions of either of us, but I just wanted to start that to begin to get us speaking together around these kinds of issues. What was the production? It was actually called, actually, I think that it was called Water. I'm not exactly sure of the name. You can probably find it easily enough. Oh, the canceled before of Water. Sorry, it was an exhibit around human zoos. I can't remember the title of it, but I know, yeah, because in my research for the city of Toronto, we uncovered that this had happened. I actually was aware of it when it was going on. Yeah, but I can't remember the title of it. I can find it out and get back to you on that. There are a couple of questions in the room. For the SIA director. I'm not sure who the SIA is. Ah, yeah, he's no longer working there, I understand. And you have to remember the what happened with that play that was supposed to go on. Not only did the youth shut it down, but Be Current, Be Current started by Audrey Zena Mondiela, and I think at that time Catherine Hernandez was the artistic director. They allied with the Black youth in Shakespeare in Action, and agreed to shut down their work as well. What are some of the first steps to creating a creative space that is respectful of cultures? I always say, have the initial conversation, be honest about what you know and don't know, be open to hearing and listening. You know who you are. Do you know who you're inviting in? Do you give them space to talk, to share? Do you ask them questions about, we really want to make you work here well. What can we do to support that? Just to have those conversations so that people can be really clear that you are open, that you are learning, that you're willing to share it in an honest way. The distinctions between coloniality and colonialism, that's an interesting question. So coloniality really is more of a concept. So for example, when we talk about decoloniality, we're talking about how do we free our minds of colonial baggage? The binaries, male, female, this, that, he, him, so he, her, et cetera, Audre Lorde said years ago that one of the problems about colonization or colonialism is that the Western world separates everything into this or that, good or bad, black or white, et cetera, et cetera. And so that becomes a real problem. Colonialism is that vehicle which has taken over or attempted to totally take over this land, that has moved indigenous people to the areas they currently are, that has brought, that has expropriated labor from Africa, jewels and other materials, even herbs and spices, etc., from all the parts of the world to build the world that we live in right now. So it's more of a practice. Some people call it the European project, that basically says, under these universal values, the West is the best, and under that rubric has the right to drag everybody else along with it. And I say drag, I mean, they would say, help us grow. Yeah, and another question here, I talk a lot about great ideas that help in early stages, like the contract. What if an explosion happens? I would suggest as best as possible, try to repair the relationship. Especially in creative work, there are at times going to be differences. So one of the things that we use in our work is something called the critical response process, developed by Liz Lerman in the Dance Exchange in the United States. It's an excellent tool because it does a couple of things. One, it really points to the importance of inquiry, asking questions to get more information. And two, it then gives individuals who wish to make an opinion a safe way of doing so, especially for the hearer. So there are 4 steps in the process. I'm not going to go through them all now. I can share later on a piece that we have on it. But basically, how to offer an opinion. So I remember one night going out to see a dance performance, and I was with my daughter, and I was also with a colleague of mine, Kevin Ormsby. And Kevin and I, we use the CRP in a lot of our work. And my daughter didn't like the performance. So Kevin opens, okay, how are we going to, my daughter goes right to what's called step 4, permissioned opinion. She wasn't asking for permission. She was just launching in. Hated it, that kind of, wow. Well, imagine an artist hearing that, if there was an artist talk back, right? Not that necessarily it would. We wear our hearts on our sleeves in our work. So how do we talk to each other in ways that are gentler, more inquisitive? How do we encourage people to be able to understand the tone that they are conveying in? And how do we have our antennae up to be able to sense discomfort? Discomfort doesn't always come up verbally. One can see it in people's bodies, in their faces, etc. And then if there are some conflicts, does it involve an individual? Does it involve the group? How best, if it's an individual, how do you have that conversation? What is your responsibility to convening that conversation? If it's a group, maybe you're bringing in a facilitator to convene that conversation. And in any contract, you learn what are essentials, not just from, I want the artist to do this, but I need to do this to enable the artist to feel good about working in this space. Yeah. So as I say, I'll share I'll find it and then put it on the chat room. And if I don't find it during this session, then I will share it later through Randy and so on. So those are the questions that are in here for me. Thank you very much for them. And I noticed that there are some links to the Liz Lerman dance exchange and the critical response process in the chat room. I highly recommend it. I highly recommend it. And it does take time to learn how to use it, but it's important. So thank you. And I'm going to pass it on, if that's okay, to my colleague and friend, Ryan Cunningham.
Thanks, Charles. Can you hear me? All right, great. Yeah, thank you so much, Charles, for that. So I thought we'd go to the beginning. What is conflict? Well, conflict is a normal process and part of any healthy relationship. Just like Charles mentioned, this is about relationality. It is in relationship with each other. As artists, our work completely involves relationships with each other, with the audience, and then of course with the organization that we're working with. And it must be expected, like any relationship, conflict will happen. So I think it's, but conflict, when handled appropriately, respectfully, thoughtfully, can actually strengthen a relationship even longer, like even more, and establish a strong foundation moving forward. So I think it's really good to remind ourselves, what is conflict? Conflict 101. There are sort of 5 main categories under that. A conflict, we must remember, is more than just a disagreement. If we find ourselves in conflict with someone else or a situation, that is a situation where both sides of the relationship perceive a threat, and that may be real or it may be perceived. But conflict is more than just a disagreement. And I think that's really important to remind ourselves, so we can understand our collaborators' responses. Conflicts, when not acknowledged, when not talked about, when ignored, they will fester, and it will grow into more negativity until it is resolved. So it's so important to identify conflict. And I say get ahead of potential conflicts. Obviously, we can't perceive everything that may or may not happen in the future, but and as an Indigenous artist, I will respond based on my own experience, and I may give some examples of my own experience from an Indigenous artistic point of view. But one of the most important things is conflicts cannot be ignored, or else they will just continue to grow. It's also good to remind ourselves that everyone responds to conflicts based on our own perceptions of the situation. And that may not necessarily be an objective review of the facts. It may be our own life experiences, our culture, our value, our beliefs, and our own experiences, intergenerationally as well. Conflicts trigger strong emotions. So I think that's always good to remind ourselves as well. It means it's important. It means somebody cares about this situation enough that they are triggered with strong emotions. And if you aren't comfortable with emotions or able to manage them in times of stress, it can get in the way of resolving conflicts successfully. So it's always good to remind ourselves about the emotions thing, especially in our work in the arts, where our job is to bring emotions, and generally in these situations, There's conflict because we care deeply about what we're talking about. And then, of course, conflicts are an opportunity for growth. Conflicts don't necessarily have to be perceived as a barrier or an obstacle, but just like Charles mentioned, it's an opportunity to establish and reaffirm our relationship with each other. I think it's really good to remind ourselves as well that systems of inequity are deeply embedded in Canadian institutions. Systems of inequity are deeply embedded in Canadian institutions. So, as Indigenous artists coming into a room, there is already a power dynamic. There's a power dynamic in our country, in the nation state called Canada. And so as Indigenous artists coming into these relationships, these partnerships, potential collaborations, we need to acknowledge this power dynamic, the inequity that has been experienced. And I also really like that Charles mentioned diversity, equity, and inclusion training can't be just a box checked. You know, and it's also not going to be solved in one session or necessarily one workshop. And so I feel like the lack of understanding the scope of the context, the scope of the issue, prevents people from deeply understanding equity. So how, moving forward through conflict, which will happen, one thing, we've been exploring different protocols and systems with Indigenous work. Many of the productions that I've been involved in that are being written and produced now across the country deal with murdered and missing Indigenous women, residential schools, cultural genocide, unmarked mass graves of children. And therefore, there's a lot of context coming into this space. And I was involved with a production earlier this year that dealt with murdered and missing Indigenous women. And it was just 3 actors, 3 of us in the show. So it was very intense, and a lot on only 3 artists. And right from the beginning, the director took the time right at the beginning to establish what is going to be our process. We knew there would be conflict in the room. We knew there would be issues that was going to make us emotional. They would be conflicting views on very serious issues. And so we found it very, very important. Day one, sit down and see what we needed. We understood that it was going to shift over the process, but we needed to establish how we were going to move forward and how we were going to set up a safe place to speak truth to power, a place where the power dynamic is acknowledged and there's discussion around how best to work through that. We also gave ourselves permission that when these things came up, we will have to stop rehearsal. We have to take the time to discuss this. Maybe we don't take our breaks every hour and 45 minutes or 3.5 hours, and we stop there, take a break, come back to discuss or talk more. But it's so important to establish a safe working relationship and process. In Indigenous cultures, this is treaty. We had treaties between Indigenous nations long before Europeans and settlers arrived in North America. And the treaties weren't just talked about, agreed, and then left there. A treaty is a living agreement, a living document that evolves, that grows, and adjusts to the realities, the values of both partners, the needs and expectations and the wants. and all of those things shift. So I feel like it's really important, a really important way to get ahead of conflict is to establish a protocol of relationship, like a treaty. How do we move forward? What are our values? What are the potential barriers ahead of that? And it's also being aware when someone is uncomfortable. Many people, directors, choreographers, artistic directors, administrators, it's really important to understand the power dynamic that you hold in these positions. And often it might be left to you to identify when potential conflict could be happening, identify when an artist or someone is uncomfortable, and to have the strength to get in front of it, understanding that it won't be easy. So moving forward through conflict, obviously healthy responses are empathy, the capacity to empathize with other people's viewpoint, whether you believe it or not. It's providing that safe platform. Of course, people are emotional in conflict because they care, and it's always good to remind ourselves to talk through the conflict, trying to stay calm and non-defensive. That's where I feel like conversations break down within conflict as soon as people get defensive. And having that treaty, that relationship foundational conversation and work at the beginning helps us to stay calm. I mean, there must be a readiness to forgive, of course, and to move past the conflict without holding resentments, and the ability to seek compromise. Charles talked a lot about the power dynamic of the director and this traditional Euro-Western institutional hierarchy that was in the past. And we are finding that much of the work being created is not hierarchical, but horizontal. And so it's being aware of that. And it's the reminder that conflict allows us to move forward with a stronger foundation. And some of the successful ways of conflict really depends on stress, of course. And I know that's easy to talk about, but usually in our work, there's a fair bit of stress behind us. There's always a deadline. There's always an opening night. But the stress is what pushes us into emotional conflict and doesn't allow us to stay calm. We also, I find that with our personal relationships and the work we do, it's so personal sometimes. It's easy to forget that we are in a professional relationship as well. And that relationship needs to work through. And so we have to pay attention to our feelings being expressed or our beliefs being expressed. And I think in conflict, especially in the arts world and performing arts, it's good to clarify right from the start if it's an emotional reaction to something that's happening, and perhaps that needs the time to unpack, because often we have the reaction, the emotional reaction, and quite often I've been in a situation where I actually can't verbalize or express why I'm feeling this way, or why this decision in the process is making me feel uncomfortable. And often I need time to think about it, process it for myself. Sometimes it is intergenerational. Sometimes it's trauma that I have experienced through my friends. And it's really good to understand that sometimes we can't solve the conflict right away. And then, of course, we have to just ultimately be aware and respect differences, that we all have differences. And so, yeah, I guess in conclusion, it's about communication, like Charles said, establishing the modes and process of communication, because it will be different for everyone. And to also understand that we need to check in regularly. Maybe that process needs to shift. Maybe what was needed in the room the week before is not needed anymore, or something else is needed. So it's checking in and establishing a safe place. And by checking in, you can check if that's a safe place. I just saw a note, there's some questions. So why don't we move to some of these questions? And if one of the hosts, I'm using my phone, I'm not used to this, so please, one of the hosts, if you can step in, if something's
I
gone
got
wrong.
it, Ryan. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not seeing any questions directly to you yet. These are
I
the
see.
same questions that were, I'll dismiss them. There we go.
Oh,
So,
I see.
Yep. Sorry, I should have cleared that earlier.
Yeah. I think that kind of wraps it up. I'd love to take any questions now or later. Charles, I don't know if there's something that
questions, yeah, that because I think that Ryan's laid out a number of really important points. And so if people have questions, here's one now, Ryan, I'll read it out to you.
Thank you.
Oh, there are a number of questions. Sorry. What? Okay. No. Oh, actually, open. The concept of safe space feels different now. How do you define it?
It's defined by the people in the room. It's defined by the people in the room. It must, because safe space changes. Safe space is based on our own context in life, our own traumas, our own history, and it depends on the production as well. A safe space within a musical could look very different from safe space in a one-person play. A safe space, yeah. So it's just like the treaties, just like relationships. You need to find out what that safe space is.
I think that's the question we have. So there may be other questions that come back later for Ryan as we continue on. I would suggest before we have Nadia, if we can just take a bit of a health break. It's so funny in Zoom world. It's like, anyway, so why don't we take a 10 minutes, it's 3:15 Toronto time. I'm not sure where you are and what time it is, but let's take 15 minutes and come back. And then there may be some other questions for Ryan, and then we'll get into Nadia and then follow that up with Jennifer. So thanks everyone. We'll see you in 15 minutes.
Hey, Charles. There's a question in the answered column that Ryan should probably see.
He has a lot of questions, so we'll work with them. Hi, folks. We're going to get underway in a minute. And Ryan, I hope you're still around and have your camera working. People had some chance to think, and there are a number of questions for you. There he is. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the questions. Ryan, you got some people thinking here. So I'm going to start at the top. So you did the safe spaces. Another question, can you talk about what happens when conflict between an artist of color and a white artist, and specifically what happens when white artists do believe and want to understand how a conflict might be tied to race and culture? Ooh, wow.
Wow. Do you mind repeating that, Charles?
Sure. Can you talk about what happens when conflict between an artist of color and a white artist happens, I assume, and specifically what happens when white artists believe and want to understand how a conflict might be tied to race and culture?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a big question to unpack that. It's a good question. I can talk to, I've seen this situation happen before, and I've seen the diverse artists get really mad and upset. And part of that context is, I've heard this reaction a lot. Why am I doing your work for you? So when a non-diverse or a person wants to understand the cultural and potentially racial context of something, that can be a reaction. And that can be a reaction based on people's trauma and their own experience. Unfortunately, that's not the best way forward in these kinds of situations, but I just bring that up because, it happened when I was part of a project and the land acknowledgement question was brought up. And so the two artists who were not Indigenous, they said they would do it. They'd take care of it. And so they did, and they came back, and we had to rewrite everything. But I asked one of them, I said, why didn't you just come to me? I'm the only Indigenous person here on the project. I mean, I'm fine with you doing it. And she said, well, actually, she was part of a project before. And she said exactly that. She went up to an Indigenous person who was part of the project and just asked if she could help her understand the racial context. And this Indigenous person got very angry and said, that's your job. Why am I doing your work for you? This and this and that. And so this artist didn't feel comfortable coming to me and asking me questions and guidance and support for it, which I would have given. And it's really unfortunate that she had that experience, but it's also, it's a very important experience because you will have that reaction from people. It can. I am of the thought in the school that always question, always talk. The only way we're going to understand each other is by asking questions. If we don't know, then we need to do that. However, I would suggest before going into that situation, you do as much research and work on your own time that you can to further understand as much as possible. And then you're bringing something to the table. You're bringing something to the conversation. And this brings up a really important point where, say, a major theater company, their formerly white male artistic director has left. And so they've chosen an artistic director of color. And sometimes they're the only person of color now on the staff. And it's the same idea that it's placing all of that work on this one individual. And when you've had to experience and work through that for many, many years, sometimes it can be very frustrating.
Thank you. There's only time for a couple of them. Sorry. We will look at these questions and try as best to get back. There's one curious about your thoughts on negotiations within a limited time period, the time it takes to collaboratively create inside a lateral power structure while working on shorter contracts?
I guess I'm not quite sure what the question was, but it was about time.
Yeah, limited time, which happens a lot in projects, right?
Of course it does. Yeah, of course it does. But if you want to work with these kinds of artists on these kinds of projects, sometimes it won't be done in that limited time. And so you have to, it's not a product that can be carved out and punched out and worked through necessarily on an 8-hour, 6-day work week or a 5-day workshop. You have to accept that it may not get to where you're hoping it will. But these are the kinds of things that you can't rush. I also think that speaks to the system that we work within, which is a Euro-Western based structure under equity that is based on a European model. It's based on a model. The hours are based on that model. And so we are now talking about working with artists and projects that have never been a part of that model. So you can't expect it to fit into it. I call it trying to put a circular peg through a square hole. It just doesn't go. And so it may not fit into that schedule. And that's just the reality.
Thank you. We're going to move on to some of the other speakers. We may have time to come back to some of these questions. There were a few, really appreciate them. But I think some of the other questions that are being asked will be addressed by the other speakers who are coming up. Thanks, Ryan, and hang in because we may come back to you. So Nadia.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having me and for being here and for your attention. My weekend was bookended by today's session, and I spent the greater part of the day on Friday working with a theater company, trying to hold space for them after being rocked by the outcome of a harassment investigation. And so I'll say to you what I said to them. In addition to my work at Park People, I have a small consulting practice. I work mostly with arts and nonprofit organizations, everyone from small collectives to large funders. I've worked with over 50 organizations in the last 3 to 5 years, all in the arts in every sector, music, theater, dance, writing, you name it. And I'm very quiet and very low profile. And what I mostly do is hang around the edges of the community and try and pick up the pieces, to be honest. And so I come to you in good faith. And most of what I get asked to work on or work with or work through is conflict. And I can't tell you what the last 3 years. And I know you've lived through it, many of you, and are living through it, but the level of conflict in the arts and how it is manifesting is extraordinary. And so in my section today of sharing with you, I'm really going to focus on some tools and some frameworks and some questions for all of you to take away with you, to use with you, because this is also about how do you navigate the day-to-day and how do you work with people that you have to see every day, whether you agree with them or not, and how do you work in your discipline, in your sector, and your passion and your art. And so I'm also, many of you are here because you deeply care about social justice. I do think that there are a few concepts in social justice work that have not served us well, and I might poke at them along the way. So just fair warning there. But let me start here. And please feel free to drop in the chat if any one of these statements resonate with you. Charles, is my screen up?
Yes, it is. Yeah, sorry, I muted.
Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you. So just some thoughts. Words and ideas, their origins, and how we use them matter. Marginalized people and communities do not need fancy language or theory to inform them of their own lives. We all have our own entry points to and learning curves in the work. And powerful social justice concepts and movements can be and often are co-opted and used against the very communities they are meant to liberate. if any of those resonate for you. Just something to think about, and feel free to share your thoughts in the chat. And so under the headings, you'll find some names, and they're either ideas I'm referring to or people who are thinking and writing about these things right now. Maurice Mitchell published a very powerful article just at the end of the year called Building Resilient Organizations, I think through the Forge magazine. It's an online magazine. So I encourage you to read that, particularly if you have any kind of leadership role in an organization. And anyone who has done a workshop with me on conflict knows that I spend a great deal of time working with people around what is their approach to conflict, where does it come from, what does conflict look like in organizations, how does it manifest? And so, I'm going to sidestep all of that to say conflict can be avoidant. Charles talked about this, Ryan talked about this. Conflict can be aggressive, and that looks like all kinds of ways. But the place that we want to get to is about conflict being generative. And so this idea of conflict generative means, how do we take the conflicts we're in and use them to propel either movements or organizations or sometimes ourselves forward? So the spirit of generative conflict, because as Ryan said, it's not going anywhere, and it's not necessarily unhealthy, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a hard thing no matter what. So that is the first framework for you, to think about generative conflict or conflict in a generative way. And to do that, we need to think about position and power. And so if you have some, however you define that, some questions for you. Why don't people trust your organization? So there is distrust of organizations that is healthy. There is skepticism that is healthy. And then there are the times that we live in that are specifically anti-institution, anti-expert, anti-leadership, and some for some very good reasons, and sometimes not so much. But for those of you in leadership positions, why don't people trust your organization? Is it because nothing's ever been done about a problematic employee or manager? Is it because the gaps are too wide? Is it because there's no opportunity of access? Is it because you haven't been listening? Why don't people trust your organization? Are you more than? Are you more than a supervisor, more than an artistic director, more than an executive director, more than a manager, more than a director, more than a producer? Are we creating the spaces for mentorship, for leadership, for coaching? So are you more than? Where is the opportunity? And this question is specifically directed at anyone who is Gen X or older in the audience. Somebody posted in the questions about intergenerational conflict, and I know it was a question too about younger folks in the arts. And the truth is that we have failed. Okay, we have failed younger generations in the arts. We have not done the mentorship, and we need to. And they are poking and disrupting and challenging in ways that can be really annoying, but also really important. And I'll talk about that. And I have heard from leaders and artists and activists who have said, no, it's their job to come to me as a supplicant. Right? These are attitudes and phrases that I have heard people say. It's not my job to teach them. And I want to say the opposite. Where is the opportunity we are providing? And that lies into the previous question, which is, where is the mentorship? I can tell you from experience, I was the most insufferable student activist. And did I change my institution? Yes. Could I have done it at less harm and cost to myself? Yes. Is there, does rage and trauma often look like self-righteousness? Yes. So it's my job to self-regulate. It's my job to learn boundaries, and it's my job to mature in the work. But it's, your job to hold the space and to provide the guidance and to answer the questions. So where is the opportunity? Have we created spaces? And you can define that any way you want. And I'm kind of going to avoid the safer space piece, but have we created spaces where people can ask? Have we created spaces where people can answer? Have we created spaces where there is dialogue, where there is conversation, where people can be vulnerable, where people can make mistakes, where people can get it wrong? Have we created the spaces? Is it reciprocal? And by that, it could be respect. Is the respect reciprocal? Is the attention reciprocal? Is the validation reciprocal? Is the visibility? And are you clear? Are you clear on policy? Are you clear on communication? Are you clear even on how does somebody come to you? How do you want to be approached? You know, positionally within an organization. So these are some questions if you are in a position where you have influence, where you have power. On the other hand, if you are in a position where you might have less power, however you define that, the question for you, is it outrage or is it activism? And they are not the same thing, okay? Because outrage is a dead end and it does nothing. It does nothing for us. Are we fighting the small war or the big war? And the small war might look like this. Is there a gender neutral bathroom in the space that is accessible? That's, you know, organizationally speaking, on an individual access basis as a communication point. But the small war might be, oh my God, did you see what that person said on Facebook? Isn't that outrageous? They should be shamed, they should be canceled, it's the end. And is that a good use of your time? And does that do anything for us? So it's about the level of system. And we need to think about where your energy goes, where your time goes, where your efforts go. Is it about the relationships between you and others? Is it about the organization? Is it about the community? Is it about society? Small war, big war. Big war is, are we creating it? Are we making a safer space in the arts overall? Are we fighting for better pay and better representation and more opportunity of access and more government funding, right? Those are some of the big war pieces. This is actually a question for everybody, so I'm going to save that. And if you are going to burn it down, what are you going to replace it with? So that's my question for those of us, you know, and usually I would be the first to hand you a match, but the activism is not the act of burning it down. It's the act of building it back up, okay? And finally, a question for all of us deeply is, what is your definition of respect? Because we need to know what that is in order to ask for it, in order to demand it. So again, these are meant to be questions, some provocative, but they're meant to help guide us, you know, wherever you are based, power-wise, position-wise, and that might change, you know, who you are in your organization and who you are walking down the street at night. You know, might not change, but the positionality does. And so questions for all of you, for all of us, do our actions equal our rhetoric? Because you can do all the readings and be the finest spoken, you know, person when it comes to matters of social justice and be a complete asshole, and pardon my language. And you have to think about the impact that that makes and what it does to our credibility and what it does to our integrity and what it does for the things we care about and want to move forward. Does your identity come with any politics? And so in my first slide, I talked about social movements being co-opted. And I would say that identity politics has been the first casualty of co-optation and of neoliberalism. And Barbara Smith herself, who helped co-found the idea of identity politics in the 70s and 80s, has come back since and said, it's like we took all the identity and left the politics on the floor, because it's not enough to go through the laundry list of who we are and what our identities are, because it says nothing really about where you stand, how you work with people, how you treat people, what your values are. It says nothing. And so the politics matter, and the politics of engagement matter. And when we use identity just to advance ourselves as opposed to our communities, that's where we run into problems. Where is the common ground? Where is the common good? And finally, is this the right place? And a lot of us treat our workplaces as the site of all of our activism, right? And keeping in mind that it's, yes, your art, and yes, your discipline, and yes, your passion, and yes, the statement you want to make about the world. It's also a place of employment. And we need to think about, is it the right place? And we often try and do things within the spheres where we think we have influence. And so all of these things come to bear in the workplace when that might not be the right place for it, right? And that's where old school activism comes in, being at protests, being at rallies, writing the letters, tackling the big issues. So small war, big war, everybody. Okay, so those are my questions. And to help navigate some of those questions, I want to take you through how to have a difficult conversation. And if this were less of a panel and more of a workshop, we'd actually be doing the practice. So you're gonna have to bear with me. This is the work of Judy Ringer. And the whole point here is to give you entry points and to give you tools. Judy Ringer is an Aikido artist, a martial artist, for those of you who are interested. And she does tremendous work on communications using the principles of martial arts and Aikido in particular, to think through how to communicate with people that you love and care about. And what she does is break down the idea of a difficult conversation. And to do that, we need to think. So if you ever have to have this hard conversation about equity, somebody asked about, framed it as, it's a theater company, or they're trying to do the work, and younger artists, are blowing up at them, even though all the things are in place, or you're trying to navigate, somebody who in fact doesn't care, or an organization that doesn't care about the work. And so the tools for yourself, and this is all preparation, everybody. Most of the work is the preparation. And I can't emphasize that enough. And this is, I would argue, also a form of ubiquitous self-care, which is, putting your energy in the right place. And so when you're having a hard conversation about equity, you want to define the purpose for yourself. What is the reason for having this conversation, or raising this topic? What do you want to accomplish, and what do you want to be the outcome? So those are the first two pieces, purpose and outcome. The third step here is, what are the assumptions that you're making? Are you assuming that they have no knowledge, that they don't care, that they couldn't possibly understand where you're coming from? What are the assumptions that we make when we're getting ready to have this conversation? And this is about your own feelings and your own position, because you might be coming from a place of powerlessness, or feeling powerless, or feeling intimidated, or feeling scared. And all of those are legitimate things. What we can't do is project them onto other people. Okay. So think about your purpose. What's your reason? Think about your outcome. What do you want to happen? Think about the assumptions you're making, and try and leave those at the door. For those of you in film, what is the backstory? So, and it ties into assumptions. What buttons are being pushed here? Are you a survivor? Is there microaggressions at work? Are you experiencing this for the umpteenth time, and the umpteenth production? So what is your backstory? And what is the personal history of yours that is being triggered? Because it helps to know what it is, so that it's not the thing that spills out, that you can actually have the conversation. And so tying with your assumption is, what is the attitude you are going into the conversation with? Is it that this is going to be this horrible conversation, nothing's ever going to happen, nothing is going to change? Because it doesn't serve you, So, and it ties into, what is the outcome you want? And in brackets here, I have the enemy. So who is this conversation with? And are you framing this as oppositional? Or is this about opportunity? What is it that they might need? An ED might need the support of their board and may not have it. A manager may need the support of their ED and may not have it, but they're genuinely, committed. And it's important that we don't simplify things, that we see the big picture, that we see all the different things that work here when we're thinking about all of the things that affect trying to get a different equity outcome. Needs and fears. What are your needs? Do you need to be recognized? Do you need to be validated? Do you need a policy made? Do you need a response or responsiveness? Do you need your colleagues to step up? What are the things that you need or that the outcome might need? And what are the things that you're afraid of? And might there be anything in common here with the person you're having the conversation with? And then the last part, and this can be a really hard part, especially if you are on the receiving end of something, is, have you contributed in any way? What part have we played in this conversation that needs to happen, in this issue, and what needs to happen? So this is the very quick and dirty and probably the fastest breakdown of the anatomy of a difficult conversation that I've ever done. But if any one of these entry points resonates for you, I suggest looking up Judy Ringer's work. She's accessible online. She really breaks down questions. She has some great videos. And the point is to do the preparation, to really take the time to think about it, to think about the outcomes you want, what it is that's blocking you from that outcome. And to help summarize it, when you're having a difficult conversation, and particularly about equity or diversity or inclusion or social justice or any iteration of those concepts, inquiry, what are the things you need to know? Acknowledgements, what are the things you have heard? Advocacy, how do we move our points forward? And problem solving, that's how we work together. So, and this is more for people who are in positions of power and influence. When somebody comes to you, these are the things that you need to think about and be able to do. And so I'm going to provide some prompts. And anyone can use this, but again, it's directed more for people in the arts who are in positions of leadership. If you want to bring something forward, I'd have something I'd like to discuss with you. I think it will help us work together. I'd like to talk about X subject with you, but I really would like to hear from you first. Something just happened and I really need your help. Can we talk about it? Can we talk about it soon? So not to let it lie. I think we have different perceptions. What is your thinking? More simply, I'd just like to talk. I think we may have different ideas. I'd like to see if we can reach a better understanding. So, these are meant to be openings. They're meant to be openings for you and for you to just give some structure to the things, to the way you want to reach out to people, especially when they have something to say about equity. And so the last thing I'll leave for you in terms of sharing is this. And I find myself asking it more and more these days, especially in the arts, which is, how do you want to be in community? And you have to be able to answer the question, and you have to be able to live by the principles, because otherwise it's not going to work, and it hasn't been working. So thank you, everybody, and I'm happy to look at the questions and chat.
Thank you, Nadia. There are a couple of questions that are in the chat. Just give me a second. Some of these are to Ryan, but you may also, Ryan, if you can join for a second. There's one about examples of Canadian institutions, and you both can answer this actually, where the inequities are deeply embedded in your view.
Well, I can maybe start, and Ryan, I know the question.
Ryan can join, sure.
Well, I would say governance is an example of inequity being deeply embedded, because our governance systems in the arts aren't working for us, and they often act as gatekeepers, rather than opening the doors, and EDs and artistic directors often have to spend a great deal of their time managing their board rather than engaging with their artists. Or their communities, and so and the structure of governance is such that it does not serve arts institutions. So that would be one system for sure.
Ryan?
Yeah, I think it's really important to mention some context. It was the Royal Commission done in the late 50s, early 60s by the Canadian government, which said they must commit resources, time, money for culture in Canada. And under that Royal Commission, there's this amazing paragraph, I don't have it on me, but basically Indigenous stories and people were not included in the definition of Canadian culture. So every regional theater across Canada, which got full funding in the 60s, was based on exclusion of Indigenous stories and culture. And it's this concept of what Canadian culture was in the 60s, which was very Eurocentric. And as we know, very English-based from the theater perspective point of view. So the foundations of our arts institutions are based on that, exclusion. So it's big systems. And what I tell artistic directors is that it has to be top down. It has to start with the board. If you want, say, Indigenous collaborations, audience building, you have to have an Indigenous person on the board. Then you have to have Indigenous directors, and not to just direct Indigenous plays. And then, of course, Indigenous artists, designers, staff, all the above. And it's really hard to get major organizations to understand that, even in 2023. I remember when I was the AD at Native Earth, Tim Carroll, the current artistic director at the Shaw Festival, he called me up and said, cold called and said, hey, I'm the incoming AD, and I think it's crazy that the Shaw Festival doesn't have a relationship with the local Indigenous community. Can we have a meeting? Can we go out for coffee and can you help me with this? And I did. I drove him out to Six Nations. I introduced him to Indigenous artists, but I told him it's got to start from the top down. You got to have someone on your board. Then you've got to personally go out to the closest reserve and start to build a relationship yourself. And a year later, there was an Indigenous person on the board of directors at the Shaw Festival. And they started hiring Indigenous artists, and they hadn't in 38 years. So that's how you start. And just to give the context that we are just starting.
Thanks, Ryan. There's a question on books that anyone can suggest. I'd suggest that we just put those into the chat room, preferably Canadian. Always understand that. I did put one in the chat room that I've been using quite a lot around conflict, particularly on quote unquote microaggressions. It's called Subtle Acts of Exclusion. And it really explains that microaggressions aren't just this theoretical thing. They basically say to a person, you're welcome or not. And if enough microaggressions happen, the person likely leaves or explodes. And I think that that's what happened with the two people I mentioned earlier with an organization that I talked about, the two-spirited Indigenous person and then the Black woman. So we'll put those into the chat, other really good books that you can look at. And I think that would be really helpful to go along. Are there other questions? Any questions for Nadia? I would love it if anyone would reflect on their view of the difference between disagreement, conflict, and abuse. So Ryan, I think you started on that question of a disagreement is what? So maybe look at three terms: disagreement, conflict, and abuse. What are the differences? That's a really good question. Thank you.
That's a question to the panelists, Charles?
The panelists, yep.
Well, what I can say is when I do my conflict workshops, the definition of conflict I work with is conflict starts with not having your needs met. So that's where conflict starts. It's very, very low in terms of just a definition. And the question then is, how do you express your needs, and can they be met or not? And then what happens, particularly in workplaces, if our needs cannot be met? So conflict, if we take the most basic definition, and I think Ryan offered a definition as well, it's, conflict it happens when our needs are not met.
So disagreement and abuse, any comments on that?
Well, abuse speaks to a power dynamic of someone who has power over another and is abusing that dynamic, I believe, in a way. Disagreements, I feel like, sits in a place where two parties have a different idea of the answer to a question or the situation. But I was going to say, but not in conflict, but not in opposition. You can have a disagreement without opposition. Yeah.
And we can also have disagreements that are not personalized.
Yep.
And this is where, like, the harm of, I would say, social media and other polarizing effects have come to play, right? That it is perfectly possible to disagree on values, to disagree on ideas, to disagree on outcomes, and it's okay. It's not personal, and I could still be your friend after. But like, we're in a place where that's becoming harder and harder to do. It shows up in all kinds of ways, right? Like, disagreement is often taken as being a threat, or from people in authority. And if you just with the boss or the artistic director, like, there's the repercussions of that, And so learning how to disagree, I would say, is the first step in all of this.
Because there can be respect within that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But actually, disagreements can be very helpful if you're in a creative process to actually building. I remember once being in a rehearsal where I had a certain idea of a particular section of the work, and one of the other artists had another idea. And so we talked them through, And what ended up happening is that both the ideas were very valid and valuable, and we were able to bring them together. It meant that just because you have an idea doesn't mean I hate it and it should be thrown out. It just means I have a different perspective on that.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, just to mention, and it's something that comes up a lot now in the work I do and I see around, where it's a similar experience around triggers and around people being affected by seeing art, and being affected and becoming emotional from experiencing a piece of work or a piece of art is not necessarily conflict either. Just because someone feels something, emotions are not the problem. Emotions mean we care about it and we're being affected. And I find us in a really interesting place where that's being confused or conflated with conflicts.
Very good. Yeah. And I think it ends up being a real challenge if the disagreement, if one side, particularly the side that has power, says, I don't care. Then you're in conflict and you might be moving on to abuse. But disagreement can be very generative, especially in working together to say, hey, I see it this way. Can we have a conversation about it? Can we talk about it? I'm not seeing any other questions right now, so I do want to thank Nadia and Ryan once again. Hang on, folks. There may be other questions that come up later. We have Jennifer, who is going to share some perspectives with us now. Jennifer, over to you.
Hi. Yes, thanks. I'm glad to have the opportunity to be here today, and it's been so educational, informative to hear what the other panelists have said and shared. I'm joining you actually from the traditional territories of the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet classes office where I work are located in the traditional and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh in Vancouver. When we make that land acknowledgement, when I make that land acknowledgement, I think it's important to think about in the terms of the work that we do with law, recognizing that our systems are built and based in a colonial history, and they don't function well for a lot of people, and definitely for Indigenous people. And in using these systems in terms of trying to find better ways to resolve disputes or conflicts, invariably there are difficulties with that. And we as a profession are struggling with that. And I do want to acknowledge that. So I do have a PowerPoint. Let me share that with you. So what I was asked to do today is a bit talk about some legal options and the law and where people's rights come from and what employers' responsibilities are. And I'll talk a bit about legal options, and hopefully, if I have time, just a little bit on preventative measures or early intervention. I think a lot of what Nadia and Ryan have said are really on point about building relationships and thinking about where you're coming from and trying to look at dealing with those perspectives. In terms of perspective, as a reminder, I manage a legal advice clinic that focuses on workplace sexual harassment. And there are these projects that have been funded by Department of Justice across the country. So there is probably a service in your province that also provides this if you're encountering workplace sexual harassment. And this also frames the perspective that I bring in terms of looking at harassment and bullying in the workplace and conflict in the workplace. So I have just a few slides about harassment and violence in the workplace from a study that a center in Western, the University of Western Ontario and the Canadian Labour Congress issued in April of 2022. And it really demonstrates that people are experiencing harassment and violence and sexual harassment in the workplace. And this was a voluntary survey that was open online. So different people from different experiences have filled it out. This slide shows that people who are gender diverse and people who are non-cis gender may experience more harassment and violence than cis straight people, and that women experience more harassment than men. It's also, they also did analysis with respect to people's identity, and you can see that no one is excluded from experiencing violence and harassment. And it's actually quite astounding how Indigenous people experience quite a high percentage of, and report a high percentage of violence and sexual harassment. So when we're in a workplace, we expect to be safe. There are rights and responsibilities for everyone that help manage those relationships. And this is a list of the sources of law where they're coming from. So workers' compensation is one of the main areas and human rights. So I'll talk a bit more about those two in this presentation. And there's some minimums that are established through employment standards and labor law. And of course, for everyone in the arts, you would have a contract. So your contract would provide certain rights, be it an employment contract or a consultancy contract or even a sales commission contract. Okay. So if we look at health and safety and workplace workers' compensation, every province has a workers' compensation scheme, and it's basically an established scheme to provide some insurance to provide compensation and protection for workers if they're injured in the workplace. We often think about it as physical injuries. So if someone falls off a ladder in the workplace, and they can be compensated for that. But bullying, harassment, and workplace violence are recognized as workplace hazards in most jurisdictions. I would caution that I practice in BC, and then there are some differences in the law in each jurisdiction. So for example, I think Nova Scotia doesn't compensate for psychological injury from bullying and harassment at this time. So it's important to be aware that there may be some differences in the law that applies to you. So under most workplace workers' compensation, employers are required to provide a safe workplace. They're required to investigate and report on incidences, and they do that both to the Workers' Compensation Board and the Joint Health and Safety Committee. And the Joint Health and Safety Committee, or the Health and Safety Officer or representative, is supposed to also include participation from workers. And workers have a right to know about harassment. They have a right to refuse unsafe work, and of course, a right to participate in the process of ensuring a workplace is safe. So that, as I said, does include psychological possible risks of harm or harassment and bullying. So if we look at the definition of bullying and harassment, so this is a definition in BC, it's quite broad, including any inappropriate conduct or comments that may cause humiliation or intimidation, right? So really, one has to look at the context of the situation to determine that, and WorkSafe BC is seeing an increase in these types of complaints. It's important to also recognize that it doesn't include what's considered reasonable action of an employer relating to management and or direction of a workplace. So if a manager or supervisor is providing feedback in not the best way, that might not be bullying and harassment. However, if a supervisor is providing feedback in a way that's constantly criticizing or may include microaggressions, it may constitute bullying harassment. So it is quite contextual. If we look at another definition, this is from the Canadian Labour Code, and in the last couple of years, there's been new regulations with respect to violence and harassment prevention, and this is supposed to increase the protection to workers in the federal system or workers for a federal undertaking. So as I mentioned before, employers have to ensure the workplace is safe. They have to have safety policies and procedures. Most workers' compensation systems require them to have a bullying and harassment policy and a violence prevention policy, and inform and train workers on those, and ensure that supervisors and managers also know how to deal with those complaints. And the employer is responsible to investigate and address complaints, and that is actually an obligation, even if there's not an official complaint made. If the employer is aware there might be something happening, the employer is supposed to take it upon themselves to investigate and deal with the issue. Workers also have responsibilities under the workers' compensation system, and that is, as I think all of us would do, to take steps to protect our own health and safety, but also to take steps to protect others at our workplace. There's a requirement to cooperate with investigations in the joint health and safety committees and participate with representatives. And of course, the Act does say that there's a role for workers to prevent and report bullying and harassment. Obviously, any worker should not engage in bullying and harassment, but there's also a requirement stated in the report, in the Act, to report bullying and harassment. We would say that if you're considering reporting bullying and harassment that you have observed happen to someone else, that the best way to consider that is to take the time to discuss with the person who's experiencing that and find out how they want to deal with it, what support they might want. There are ways you might report without providing specifics, or it might be that instead of doing a formal report, you might do what's called a disclosure, where you find someone that you feel safe with to discuss this issue, to see if it can be addressed more informally. You do have to recognize that if a disclosure is made to an employer, the employer may still have an obligation to investigate, but they may not need to provide any identification with respect to the person making the complaint. And of course, workers are responsible to follow policies and procedures. So the other main area where the law provides protection with respect to unfair treatment is the human rights law, and that's if it's based on discrimination on a prohibited ground. So the slide lists some examples of some prohibited grounds, and this list comes from the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the Canadian Human Rights Act, but they are basically similar across the different codes in each province. So if someone is experiencing discrimination based on their race and has a negative consequence at work, so might feel intimidated or unable to participate, may have been denied an opportunity to take a role or participate in collaboration, that might be discrimination. And it doesn't matter if that was intended or an unintended consequence. It's the effect that it has on the person and whether it can be objectively seen as discrimination or unfair treatment. Okay. So both with workers' compensation and human rights systems protect against reprisals, because often people are afraid to report because they think something may happen, both from the worker or other employees. And some examples of reprisals are taking away hours or responsibilities, harassment, preventing from participation. So there are additional protections in those systems. So effectively, you would make another report and complain that would be investigated. Employment standards and labor relations law set out basically the minimums for working conditions, such as wages, overtime, how your employment should be terminated. So if your contract doesn't provide that any specifics, then you can make a complaint to employment standards with respect to these types of issues. Of course, you have your obligations that are under your contract, and that contract may provide specific rights and obligations that are more significant than those provided by employment standards, but they can't be less than your rights under statutory law. There are some exceptions where people may not have coverage. So for example, someone who's a consultant may not be covered by workers' compensation. A volunteer working may not be covered by workers' compensation, but they would be entitled to protection under the human rights law. So there's some cases where you might not have the same protection as someone who's an employee and worker. If you get to the point where you feel your rights have been violated and you want to make a complaint and start a legal action, each of those areas of law have a different dispute resolution body, and those are listed here. If it's significantly serious enough, for example, sexual assault, you may want to make a criminal complaint and go to criminal court. These options may not be mutually exclusive. You might be able to pursue more than one, so it's always good to get some legal advice if your conflict has risen to the state that you feel that you need to pursue a legal option. So just to cover briefly, if you were to pursue an option of making a complaint to workers' compensation, they have two arms. One is prevention, so they're responsible to prevent any health and safety risks. So if you make a complaint to the prevention branch, they might look to see if your employer has a policy, if the employer failed to follow their policy, if they haven't resolved the complaint, and try to encourage the employer and order the employer to take action. Workers' Compensation Board does not itself do the investigation if it goes to prevention. Under compensation, if you were injured, then if you make a claim, then you might be compensated for the injuries. So in terms of bullying harassment, for example, you might be experiencing psychological illness, anxiety, depression. Those are illnesses that are accepted for compensation under workers' compensation law. The challenge is that in most jurisdictions, there's a definition. You have to link that harm was caused by the work situation. And so, for example, in BC, it says that the psychological harm must have been caused by a significant trauma at the workplace, for example, a sexual assault, or a series of significant stressors. So that could be microaggressions or ongoing harassment or abuse in the workplace. But then a psychiatrist has to link that. A psychiatrist or psychologist has to link that abuse to your illness to get compensation. So it's a little complicated, but it is possible to get support. Under human rights, they can also provide compensation in the form of lost wages and expenses and injury, what's called injury to dignity. So for the harm caused to you because of the discrimination. The purpose of human rights remedies is to try and put you in the place if the discrimination had not occurred. So it can also include reinstatement to your previous work if you felt you had to leave work, and conditions around that work to provide protections for you. So that includes ordering the employer to draft or improve their policy, or ordering the harasser or the workplace to undertake some training. If you're a member of a union, you can file a grievance and go to a labor arbitration. You have to recognize that that grievance is not yours as the complainant, but the union's. So the union gets to determine if they're taking it forward. The union gets to decide if they're settling it. Usually the union discusses that with the complainant in making that decision, but it is an important distinction that's different from, for example, bringing a human rights complaint. It's important to recognize labor arbitrators also have the right to look at human rights harm and give similar, to some extent, similar awards to what you would get under human rights. But there's new law out that says union members can't, some union members can't go to file a human rights complaint either. So it depends on how your legislation is drafted in your particular province. So for example, the case that determined that means that people in Manitoba, if you're in Manitoba, you cannot both file a human rights complaint and pursue a labor arbitration. You can only go to the labor arbitration. And in British Columbia, you can still pursue both options. Civil court is always an option where there's been a breach of contract, or you may have just left work. So constructive dismissal or wrongful dismissal means that your work has been terminated and you don't believe it was fair. So in constructive dismissal, it might mean that, for example, in our work, that you were sexually harassed and so traumatized and you feel unsafe to go to work that you can no longer carry out your contract. And then you say that you have been constructively dismissed. Wrongful dismissal may be in a situation where you're having a workplace conflict and your employer tries to fire you for cause, basically saying, no, this person didn't fulfill their contractual duties, were insubordinate, or other types of complaints. And so we're going to end the contract. And there may be arguments for why that is not fair. So usually if you make a complaint in civil court for wrongful dismissal or constructive dismissal, all you're entitled to is notice or severance in lieu of pay in lieu of notice. So that is basically a period of time, a payment for giving you time to find another job. So sometimes it's not worth pursuing if you haven't been employed very long or your contract doesn't specify what kind of termination severance pay you might get. Other areas where you might have a breach of contract and you could ask for damages or specific performance. So if you've contracted to do or provide a particular commission work and there's some disagreement or there's a violation of your terms of contract, you aren't properly paid, then this is your remedy. And in some cases now, there's an argument being made in court that the harassment policy of an employer is part of a contract, so that some employees are trying to pursue damages for breach of contract in civil court instead of going to the human rights court tribunal. So that might be getting too complicated, but I'm sharing that with you because there are different remedies that are available if you choose to pursue them, and it's important to get legal advice because it can be a little bit complicated. In civil court, you can also bring what's called a tort claim, so for harm, and that's usually in the case of assault, and that would be against the person who assaulted you. Okay, so generally speaking, which option is it worth it? These are important questions to look at, and as I said, I think it's really important to get legal advice if you're considering that. As I mentioned, you can pursue often more than one option, but there's no double dipping. So that means if you pursued a workers' compensation claim and a human rights claim, and you had compensation for lost wages under workers' compensation, then you would not get that under human rights, but you could get an award for injury to dignity or an order about training in your workplace. There are time limits to be aware of in making complaints. So sometimes they may be different. So for example, in British Columbia, it's a 1-year time limit to file a human rights complaint from the date of the last incident, and 2 years to file a civil court claim. Some time limits may actually be as short as 6 months. So it's important to get advice if you think you're going to pursue a complaint. Another consideration is, do you think you can do it yourself, or do you need assistance? Can you afford assistance if you need assistance, or is there assistance available to you? So workers' compensation or filing with the employment standards branch, these are areas where there are staff who look and assess the complaint and claim and process it. You sometimes need to argue that if you don't get a fair decision, but often in cases those things work the way they're supposed to, and you do get some assistance through that. Whereas, for example, in human rights, it may be more challenging to take that forward to a hearing without support. Or, as I said, you might choose to pursue a union grievance where you have your union rep who helps you, which is different from pursuing a human rights complaint or a civil court claim. So the biggest thing to consider, one of the biggest things to remember, is that it takes a long time for these processes. I would say that the systems are broken, unfortunately, and it takes years. So currently, for example, a human rights complaint in British Columbia is not even being acknowledged as being received by the tribunal for a year because they're so backlogged. So you might not get a mediation date for another year, and then another year or two for going to hearing. In the Canadian human rights system, arguably you don't get any sort of movement for 5 years. So these are real things to think about and consider and get advice on in your jurisdiction about what the process is and what the realistic outcome might be and when that might be. Now, most of these systems also have a built-in early settlement method, meeting with a mediator, sometimes in civil court with a judge, and that might be helpful. It's often helpful for parties to have a third party assisting in that discussion, and so there may be reasons to try and pursue a legal option. And I think it's also important to consider the effect that it might have on your health. These issues, when they drag on and they're still in the back of your mind, do have an effect, and that you have to deal with them. And I have seen it take a toll on people. So these are all different things to consider. And the most important advice I would give is that you should try and get legal advice if you're trying to look at pursuing any of these options. So ideally, as was discussed by the great panelists before me, you don't get into that situation. You're looking at prevention, early intervention. You're looking at trying to set expectations, having a conversation in a workplace, maybe developing a charter of understanding of how to work together, or how to communicate respectfully, looking at establishing maybe codes of conduct if it's a bigger workplace. I think it's important that everybody listen and raise and address concerns early. So it's really important for the people, the employer and the people in positions of power to take the time to stop and listen. I know it's always hard in a workplace. We're trying to get something done, and you have a particular vision. To take that time, and something you say may land differently and be heard from someone in a different way than you intended. And I think it's important for people hearing that to also try and take a moment to stop and reflect and to raise those concerns if you have those concerns. So ideally, you should have an internal workplace process where complaints can be made and workers know what they are, so that they're comfortable understanding what the process is. And of course, consider different alternative dispute resolution methods if you're not able to resolve it directly. So in terms of internal processes, if you're trying to set them up, I think it's important to demonstrate organizational commitments to zero tolerance to discrimination or bullying and harassment, and trying to ensure equity, develop policies and procedures and make them available, and make sure that they're understood. In those, ensure confidentiality if someone's making a complaint. Make sure that people understand the limit to that confidentiality, because in some cases, you may have to share with the person who's responding to the complaint and what that means. Give options for people to go to different people to make the complaint or get information about the process. Sometimes the designated person who's the human resource person, or it might be designated that you go to the supervisor or manager. That might be the person, obviously, that you're having a conflict with and you're not comfortable. I think another consideration is looking at alternative peer groups, recognizing that some groups of people might not feel comfortable going to the normal people designated to have power. So thinking about having more than one avenue and person to report to. Ensure that there's education and training provided to both staff and managers and supervisors on how to deal with a complaint, how to receive it, address retaliation immediately, let people know that you will address it, and provide safety planning and resources for the complainant. So I think it's important, ideally, that you give some information to anyone who's going to make a complaint, check that they feel safe, provide, if you have the EAP, the Employment Assistance Plan. If you don't, there are some public resources available. So have a list that you can provide and support someone. And in terms of supporting complainants, I've just listed a couple key issues in terms of explaining the process, letting complainants know how information is going to be used, providing updates on the process, because sometimes these things take time and people wonder what's happening, and you're just trying to arrange meetings, but they don't know and they become more anxious. Again, providing supports and resources and addressing retaliation. So I would recommend looking at being trauma informed, and you can do a whole course on that, but I think that Ryan and Nadia have spoken a bit about those things as well. So here I've just listed a few things. If you're at different stages of reports, you can look at that later. And just briefly on alternative dispute resolution, I think it's important to think about options that you might choose to pursue if you're having a particular conflict in the workplace. Facilitated discussion with someone safe, mediation, bringing in a peer to help with the discussion, and looking at exploring culturally appropriate options. So I hope that's helpful. I think that's it. Yes, so I've also just listed, which you may already have, they are on some of the arts websites, some of the arts organizations that specifically provide legal advice to artists. And these would deal with some of the other issues such as copyright and concerns that Charles raised at the beginning. But for employment type concerns, there are always student clinics, lawyer referrals, or pro bono programs that should be available in your province that you can access to deal with those. Thanks for your time and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jennifer. And there are a couple of questions as I look at the chat room. Can you speak a little bit about protections for self-employed contractors versus employees, since the arts contractors are often treated as employees when they're really not?
Yes, so if you're self-employed, it depends on where you're working. So if you workers' compensation is set up to give you the broadest amount of protection. So if you are, for example, a self-employed but contracted to provide services on a show, and there are many people working on that show, and you're at a particular workplace or theater, then you may be treated and have the protections as a worker would under workers' compensation. So I think, though, that's an important distinction. If you're an artist who has a lot of different contracts so that it really demonstrates that you aren't tied to one employer, then it is that you won't have as much protection. So most workers' compensation plans have an option where you can pay in to get some certain protections for lost wages if you're injured. That's often hard to do because those fees are quite high. So that might not be something that you want to pursue, but that's something to look at too.
Thank you. So the question's been asked again to Ryan, and I'd suggest others might want to answer this as well. Any good books to read? He's getting one. And Jennifer or Nadia as well, any good books to read?
I'll put this in the chat, but this is by Melanie Florence, Righting Canada's Wrong, Residential Schools. It's, I've actually used this to put together a 4-hour lecture on the real history of Canada. It's written for all ages, so it's just incredible. I would suggest this for anyone wanting to know the real Indigenous experience in Canada in the last 150 years.
Excellent. Thank you.
And I'll put in.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good Canadian books out there these days that are, Nadia's put one in the chat room, and when it comes to mind, a lot of things flash through my mind, so I'll try to put a list together to send along. But I think of wonderful writers in fiction, people like Billy Ray Belcourt, for example, or Dion Brand, and these folks are just pushing boundaries with their use of language, the subject material they're bringing in, and sometimes literature can really help with increasing our understanding of people. You get these policies and procedures. Someone asked the question before around, how a white person might be able to, have a conversation with a person of color if they don't, I'm paraphrasing, buy the person of color's response as to why race is an issue. And all I can say is, well, you got to listen. You know, how could, I mean, I am an able-bodied, you know, male. How am I supposed to be able to understand the lived experience of someone who's disabled? I could say, it doesn't matter, you can get through the door, or, you know, you can read the computer. So that's the important aspect, because I can only imagine that, you know, that person of color is going to get angrier. So reading material by Indigenous people, by artists of color, by persons with disabilities, by those who consider themselves to be mad, you know, which is a term that writers have claimed. So you get an understanding of what they are articulating about their experience. I just find that we don't have enough information. There's a really wonderful book that you're talking about, and sadly not for Americans, but she's an American, Claudia Rankin. This is called Just Us. It's a brilliant book in a sense that it's conversational. She talks about, you know, she's wonderful. She teaches at a Ivy League institution. I can't remember which one. And so she gets called to do a lot of keynotes. And so she's built up so many air miles that she can fly first class almost all the time. And she's a woman of African descent, right? And so she's in line, and oftentimes white men will just walk in front of her. So there she is. How does she address that issue? And she does, because she's writing about it. But one of the things that I found really incredible in that book, where she talked about in the United States, according to some work by Washington Post, that 95% of white Americans live only around white people. 95%. So how the heck are they going to know? And we see it. Cops killing whoever they're killing, you know, what's his name, and Trayvon Martin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why it's so easy for the reactionary folks to use the issue of law and order all the time. They know who they're talking to. They know what they're talking about, right? So it's really important to get to understand those life experiences and to read the work of artists of color, of Indigenous artists, of persons who are deaf and disabled, et cetera, to have their experiences enter into your mind in some way. I think we're coming to the end. I think there's another question, sorry, in the chat room. That's done. Okay. So you're going to have your library filled, which is good. I love the expression that you should always have more books than you can manage to read, because that way you kind of keep on going. And not seeing any other questions, I do want to thank our panelists, Ryan, Nadia, and Jennifer. Excellent materials to present, and so on. And I really want to thank Canadian Actors Equity for inviting what is not an easy discussion. But, you know, it becomes easy when we have it more. So Scott, I pass it back to you.
Thank you very much, Charles. And also my thanks as well to all the panelists. So this has been a jam-packed time together. And there, obviously we could just go on exploring so many angles to these questions and these issues. And there's so much to learn and dig into. And we will be having another session on this, I believe, in a week from now. So keep your for all you still attending, please keep your eyes open for emails about that. And I want to thank our ASL interpreters as well. Thank you for being with us. And please, those of you attending, have a look at the link to the feedback survey. There will be a link that's going to be sent out to all of you. And please fill that out. It's really important to us to get some feedback on these sessions and what we're offering to the membership with our time together. So on behalf of the association, I'd say thank you all. Thanks to everybody who attended. Thanks to the great panelists, and looking forward to further conversations in the future. All the best to everyone, and we'll talk to you soon. Have a great day.
Bye. Take care, everyone.
Bye.